Hello, today I'm going to be covering Plato's Phaedrus. So Phaedrus begins as Socrates runs into his friend Phaedrus, who has just heard a speech from the popular orator Lysias. Phaedrus is going on a walk in the countryside, so Socrates offers to join him so he can hear this speech recounted. Phaedrus starts to recount Lysias' speech, and essentially the whole premise of the speech is to say that when entering into a relationship, it's always better to be with a partner who does not love you versus a partner who does love you. And the type of relationship he's referring to is a pederastic relationship. So some background on pederastic relationships is that in ancient Athenian society, it was a way for a young boy to be mentored and introduced into society through training and connections. The pederastic relationship would usually take place between a boy who is past puberty but not over 18 and a man in his mid to late 20s. An example of a pederastic relationship is like in the Symposium. Think when Alcibiades is trying to trade his good looks and beauty for Socrates' wisdom. Essentially, he was trying to enter into a pederastic relationship with him by trading sexual favors for any training and wisdom that Socrates could impart upon him. So Lysias' main points in his speech are that lovers will always keep tally of what favors they do for you, and they will regret doing them afterwards. They will always be slaves to their self-interest. They will never think of your interest. He says that when trying to select a partner, the pool of selection is much bigger if you look for people who don't love you versus people who do love you. Lovers will prevent you from spending time with other people and making essential connections because they are jealous and they don't want you to be taken from them. Lovers won't want to carry out the relationship when the desire for the body has faded, so when the boy grows up. Lovers will praise you excessively to your detriment. He says that non-erotic love has more stability, and the examples he gives are in parental relationships or friendships. And finally, he says that you should not give favors to those who need them. You should give them to people who are capable of returning them and deserving them most. So basically, you should not just give your favors to someone because they love you. They should be capable of returning the favor, and they should be deserving of the favors that they give you. So, obviously this is a very jaded, toxic view on love. As the pederastic relationship seems toxic in itself, this is kind of the most transactional, corrosive way that the relationship could be carried out. So Socrates says that, this is a very convincing speech, but it does not seem that Lysias is very knowledgeable on the subject he's giving the speech about. Socrates says that, he could give a better speech, and he is influenced to do so in this moment. So it's important to note that the speech Socrates is about to give is not his own opinions. He says in a quote that, "Now I'm well aware that none of these ideas have come from me. I know my own ignorance. I was filled like an empty jar by the words of other people streaming through my ears." So keep that in mind when we go over the Socrates' speech. Before he starts his speech, he claims that you always must define something before making a decision on it. He ends up defining love as an unreasoning desire that overpowers a person's impulse to do right and is driven to take pleasure in its beauty. It's an all-conquering force and drive, takes its name from the word force, and is called eros. So Socrates begins to make his argument against the lover. Socrates says that a man ruled by desire will turn the boy into whatever pleases him. So again, the lover is a slave to self-interest. The lover will always want a partner that is not equal to him. So whether this is physical training or knowledge, he will deny the boy philosophy. He will deny the boy even physical exercise because he would prefer for the boy to be soft and non-muscular. He would even prefer for the boy to be ugly and sickly looking. He even goes as far to say that he would prefer the boy's family to be dead or lost to him, so that way the lover could have him all to himself. He will delight in the boy's poverty, and he will prefer for the boy to remain wifeless, childless, and homeless for as long as he can possibly keep the boy dependent to him. So the main point of Socrates' argument is that when the lover is in love, he will give you no benefit. And when he is not in love, he will not keep any of the promises he made to your betterment. So if you enter into a pederastic relationship with someone who loves you, it is all to your detriment, no benefits. After he finishes his speech, his version of Lysias' speech, arguing the same point, he apologizes to the son of Aphrodite, Eros, for insulting love and speaking so poorly of love. So, if it wasn't obvious by Socrates saying that these aren't my opinions, it makes his point more obvious that these are not my opinions by him immediately retracting everything he has said about love. And he claims he is going to make a more positive speech on love to apologize to the gods. So before I talk about Socrates' positive speech on love, I wanted to jump forward to the second half of the dialogue to discuss how these two speeches just functioned as rhetorical exercises rather than actual opinions on love. So Lysias could be considered a rhetorician. He just gave a speech that he's not knowledgeable about, and it just sounds convincing. Socrates just gave a speech that had more knowledge, but still did not demonstrate positive qualities that rhetoric could take. So up until this point, how Socrates has discussed rhetoric in Gorgias and a lot of his dialogues is purely negative. He has just said that, people are abusing its persuasive power and they are not acting like a philosopher. They do not have, such as the sophist. He says they do not have any real knowledge. The only skill they have is speaking. They do not actually hold knowledge. After conceiving this point that, maybe these two speeches are not actual opinions on love, they are rhetoric exercises, I looked for a secondary source that confirmed this point of view. So Harvey Eunice's Eros in Plato's Phaedrus and the Shape of Greek Rhetoric first mentions Plato's opinion on rhetoric up until the Phaedrus. So they say that for Plato, rhetoric was not a morally neutral set of skills in language and speaking, but part and parcel of an entire set of conventional ethical and political values that needed to be uprooted and replaced with better ones. So not only are Socrates' critiques on rhetoric critiquing the sophist, but he's also critiquing Athenian justice society. So think about in Athenian court at this time, it's largely speech-based. So in the Athenian justice system, if you could sound convincing, it mattered more than what evidence and what truth you actually had, which is obviously very problematic when you're speaking of a justice system. So he starts to adopt the view in Phaedrus that it's not giving speeches itself that is shameful, but it's giving speeches in a bad and in a way with a lack of knowledge and truth that is shameful. He makes an emphasis that not only should rhetoricians be knowledgeable on the topic they're giving a speech about, but they should ultimately be very knowledgeable about the soul and the types of souls in order to give artful philosophical speeches. So in this criticism of rhetoric and in this discussion of how to give a speech artfully, Socrates is essentially reimagining rhetoric under the terms of philosophy. And in Harvey Eunice's article, they state that recent scholars have tended to label Plato's conception a philosophical rhetoric. The reasoning goes as follows. Having rejected the view of contemporary rhetoricians that a rhetor needs only an opinion on a subject of his discourse, Plato requires the expert speaker to know the truth about the subject of his discourse. So you don't just need an opinion to give an artful speech, you need to know the truth of the subject, and you need to extensively know the truth of a subject. So he gives his qualifications of an artful speech. He says that first, you must know truth concerning everything you are speaking or writing about. You must learn how to define each thing in itself. And having defined it, you must know how to divide it into kinds until you reach something indivisible. So first, you need to find the definition of the subject you're speaking about. After that, you need to perform a systematic division on the subject. Second, you must understand the nature of the soul along the same lines. You must determine which kind of speech is appropriate to each kind of soul. Prepare and arrange your speech accordingly, and offer a complex and elaborate speech to a complex soul and a simple speech to a simple one. So here's where we see Socrates kind of ease up on the negative attribute that rhetoric has of persuasion. He's actually kind of encouraging persuasion in a positive way that is leading the soul versus deluding someone or tricking someone. He says that to be an artful rhetorician, you must have an extensive knowledge of the soul and types of souls, so that way you essentially know your audience. Then and only then will you be able to use speech artfully, to the extent that its nature allows it to be used that way, either in order to teach people or in order to persuade. So there again, he's saying that, the type of philosophical rhetoric he is conceiving here can be used to teach or persuade. So this shows that Phaedrus as a whole is less about opinions about love and more about how rhetoric can be used in a philosophical and artful way, kind of taking his previous very negative perception of rhetoric and transforming it into something that he could condone and that he thinks could be used for good. Now to describe Socrates' positive speech on love as an apology to the gods. It's widely accepted that this second speech Socrates gives are his actual opinions on love, and it gives some background on how the theory of recollection and the theory of forms work together. He creates more of a narrative about how these concepts work that kind of help me to understand the concepts more as well. So he takes the corrosive madness that he presented in the second speech and turns it into a divine madness. This madness is not purely detrimental, it is also a gift from the gods. He defines the types of madness. So he says that there is prophetic madness. Think of the Oracle of Delphi. They are seized by madness, but they give, divine prophecies. He says there's ritualistic madness. So this is people who are suffering and need to overcome suffering to make amends with the gods. And he says there is poetic and artistic madness, which is the madness of inspiration caused by the muses that will assist people in producing beautiful art and poetry. So before I get into the kind of metaphysical narrative behind the theory of forms and recollection working together and the imagery he's about to create for that, I wanted to go into a parallel of the theory of recollection in the Meno. So as he states in the Meno, as the soul is immortal, has been born often, and has seen all things here and in the underworld, there is nothing which it has not learned. So it is in no way surprising it can recollect the things it knew before, about virtue and other things. Essentially, he's saying, it's important to emphasize that he says all things here and the underworld. To me, I think that's him saying, the soul is not remembering things from a physical past life in a mortal body, but it is remembering things within the time that it was between mortal lives. So when it is in a metaphysical realm, essentially waiting to occupy a new body, that's when it encounters the forms, and that's why people can recall things. So he starts to create a story on where these souls are encountering the forms. He describes that there is a higher metaphysical plane that the gods and the forms reside at. He explains that the gods have a charioteer and two good-natured winged horses. So for the gods, it is very easy to fly up and access this realm where the forms are at. However, when a human soul tries to follow the gods, it is difficult because the human has the charioteer, the good horse, but instead of having another good horse, they have a bad-natured horse. So where the good-natured horse only requires a verbal command to follow instruction, the bad-natured horse is unruly. So while the gods' chariots are effortless to control, the humans' chariots are very difficult to control. Because of this, when humans try to follow the gods up to this realm, or human souls try to follow the gods up to this realm to observe the forms, they often get on a collision with other humans trying to observe the forms. So in this process of trying to reach the realm where the gods and the forms are, the wings of the horses that the human charioteers are manning will essentially break. The whole soul will fall to earth, and then it will inhabit a mortal body. So there's a hierarchy that's introduced when this concept of the soul inhabiting a mortal body is explained. So because there are some souls that did not interact with the forms as much, and there are other souls that had more time with the forms, we get a hierarchy of what type of souls these people will have based on the time spent with the forms. So the soul hierarchy in Phaedrus goes lovers of wisdom and lovers of beauty at the top. Under them is lawful kings. Under them is statesmen and businessmen. Then doctors and exercisers. After is prophets and priests. Then poets and artists. A manual labor, a sophist or demagogue. And the lowest is a tyrant. So the philosophers are at the top. They have spent the most time with the forms in that higher realm. However, the tyrants spent little time in that realm, so they can recollect less of the forms. We could draw a parallel between the soul hierarchy in the Phaedrus and the soul hierarchy in the Republic. While they do have different qualifications on why the soul is placed in the hierarchy, they have a very similar hierarchy. In the Republic, the hierarchy is based on which part of the soul is ruling the soul. So the tripart soul, reason, spirit, and desires. We have the aristocratic soul, where reason is leading. We have the timocratic soul, the oligarchic soul, the democratic soul, and the lowest, the tyrannical soul, where desire is leading. So we have very similar concepts between the two hierarchies of the soul and these dialogues. He goes into an interesting kind of narrative about how the souls usually wait 10,000 years to grow their wings back to be able to ascend to this higher realm. But if someone chooses the life of a philosopher 3 times, they can ascend and grow their wings back in 3,000 years. Another thing mentioning with the hierarchy in Phaedrus and the hierarchy in the Republic is the hierarchy in Phaedrus actually has upward mobility and downward mobility possible, whereas the Republic, it is always downward mobility that ends in chaos. So now that he's laid the groundwork by using the theory of recollection and the theory of forms, he goes into the 4th type of divine madness, which is erotic madness. He explains that, again, using the allegory of the charioteer and the 2-winged horses, that when the charioteer sees a beautiful person, they are reminded of the form of beauty and the form of love. And in that moment, they remember their life, you could say, as a charioteer and winged horses. So it describes a teething experience of the wings, like the wings want to grow back. They want to ascend to that realm again, but they can't. And this is what causes the divine madness or the erotic madness. So eventually, through controlling the bad horse, this teething will subside and this madness will subside. And the erotic madness could actually be used as a way to cut your time short on how long it's going to take for you to ascend to the higher realm again. So this is very similar to the ladder of love in the Symposium. The ladder of love in the Symposium is at the lowest rung, you recognize a single beautiful body. Then you recognize all beautiful bodies, all beautiful souls, beautiful laws and institutions, the beauty of knowledge, and finally the highest form is the form of beauty. So here again we see how the highest form of love is recognizing the form of beauty and love in both Phaedrus and Symposium. So with all of this background information given, Socrates starts to reimagine the relationship between the lover and the boy. He says the man, after recognizing the form of beauty within the boy, has an internal struggle between the balance of the 2 winged horses, but eventually learns self-control. The man does not want a transactional relationship with the boy. Rather, he wants to worship the divine quality within the boy. The man does not want to sabotage the boy's development. Instead, he wants to train the boy in the image of the gods. Eventually, the boy will learn to love the man as he sees the divine love the man has for him reflected like a mirror. In this lasting, loving, and mutualistic relationship, they will both help each other to complete their ascension to the higher heavenly plane. Another thing Socrates' positive speech on love demonstrates is the proper use of rhetoric and that philosophical rhetoric we were talking about. So here we see him take his own advice and go through all the steps that make something an artful speech. So here we see him using rhetoric for good in the way that Phaedrus is an aspiring speech presenter and orator. He, respects rhetoric and he kind of falls for the convincingness without judging the speeches by knowledge, more so judging the speeches on convincingness. So through these speeches and through especially Socrates' final speech, he's trying to move Phaedrus' soul or persuade him to not only be a lover of speeches, but to be a lover of knowledge. Another funny point is that according to Socrates, I am giving an unartful and improper speech right now because I do not know my audience, so therefore I cannot give a speech that persuades my audience in a certain manner, and I am not knowledgeable about the soul or types of souls. So, sorry, Socrates. So that concludes my speech. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day.